Please. Tomorrow afternoon we end, on the current schedule it says closing speakers, and as I mentioned at the opening remarks yesterday, I am that closing speakers. And the topic of that speech is, will medicalization lead to legalization or paraphernalization? Yes, I just did make up a word. Our first keynote speaker, Stroup, invented marijuana law advocacy for all intents and purposes. And in 1970, after leaving, both working for a consumer commission and what has been described, as Clint Werner did the other night, as Nader's Raiders, we have the first generation of consumer advocate lawyers. They didn't work for a person and their wealth and interests. Didn't work for a corporation per se, or government, or a large institution. They started to care about consumers and how they interacted with government, taxes, and safety. And so with that discipline and savvy learned by, and at the knee of someone like Ralph Nader, who, whether you like him or not, the guy is incredibly brilliant and disciplined over his career. And so those first lawyers who came out of that, to this day, still are affecting public law in the United States. And one of those is Stroup. Again, if you haven't read High in America, you've done yourself an injustice, being a marijuana law reform advocate and not understanding the first 10 years of marijuana law reform and NORML. It's a great read. But Patrick Anderson, who had pretty much unfettered access, still wrote through his own prison. It was never his voice, it was never really his experience. When Keith retired in 2005, the Washington Post, some weeks later, ran a front page story in the lifestyle section, a very prominent one, about his retirement. And that generated a lot of media, as that kind of stuff does. But the next day, something that most authors, or wannabe authors, dream about, came to the door. A big package from one of the biggest publishing houses in the United States saying, we want to publish your memoirs. We want to publish you now that you're done, you're retired. The staff was like, wow, that's what an opportunity. Special delivery to the audience. Keith gets it and goes, boom, right in the trash. And we're like, wow, what are you, great? I don't have a book in me, I don't care. I'm busy, I don't have time to write a book. So it took a couple of years to cajole Rick Cusick and myself and others at Keith. You've got a book in you. You can talk about beginning marijuana law reform advocacy, NORML, etc., etc. There's more than enough there, believe me. And so, along with Rick and others, and then later just on his own, produced an autobiography about himself and NORML. And publishing changed in those years. He was offered that in about 2005, 2006. By the time he was ready to publish, we were looking at a total change in the way that publishing happens, and there was no big imprint house saying, let's do this. So High Times has a division for publishing books, and they will be the publisher of Keith's autobiography. As much as I would have liked to, again, had a celebrity here in Hollywood like Oliver Stone or some others we were pursuing, we certainly could have gotten somebody at the last minute. I thought, as much as it could be funny and humorous, but something more substantive. We come to these conferences to learn, and to particularly learn from those who've done a lot more, lived many more summers than ourselves. So to have Keith be able to, along with Rick, give us a keynote that is substantive, in Keith's case reflective, just distilled, Keith has the best political horse sense of anybody I've ever met or worked with other than Tip O'Neill, the former Speaker of the House. And the idea that Keith is retired has scared me to death about what retirement means because he still works 40, 50-hour work weeks. But the staff and the board and the organization is blessed that we have Keith in our retirement. So thank you very much, Keith, and thanks for publishing this book, which we're looking forward to hearing your distilled thoughts about it, and NORML, and marijuana law reform.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks to all of you. I'm a little self-conscious because I think you've already heard everything I have to say, and I'm an old man, so I have limited ideas, and so some of this will be repetitive from what you may have heard earlier. I'm actually the warm-up act for the real keynoter, who is Rick Steves. I wasn't sure I would live long enough to see full marijuana legalization. But folks, because of those 3 initiatives on the ballot this November, with a little bit of luck, all of us are going to live long enough to see marijuana legalized in America. The initiative process has given us the opportunity to leap ahead a few years. I mean, we had legislators who've been willing to introduce legalization bills in a few states already, but the bills don't even usually get a hearing, and they certainly don't have enough support at this point to move forward. But in those roughly, I think, 24 states that have the initiative process, obviously that allows the people to get out ahead of their elected officials if the elected officials are timid. And as we know on our issue, they generally are. So this combination of factors where we now have more than half of the adult population in this country that agree with us provides us the opportunity where we have the resources to qualify a full legalization proposal for the ballot. We have a chance to win these things and win them several years earlier than would have otherwise been the case. And I'm going to talk just briefly about 3 or 4 principles that I think, at least for NORML. Now, a lot of times when we talk about we and legalization, we're talking about the movement in general. My comments today are primarily going to have to do with NORML and how I think the principles that I think should be our guiding principles as we move forward, our moral compass, if you will. First, NORML is, as Alan suggested, a consumer lobby. We always have been. And that distinction will only become more important as we move into the full legalization phase, and I'm going to come back and address that a little bit. Secondly, as I say, we now enjoy the majority support of the support of the majority of the American public, but that also means that we have to tailor our proposals to appeal to the non-smokers. Smokers represent somewhere between 11 and 13% of the adult population, depending on what state you're in. A few states may even be a little higher. But that's far short of a majority. So obviously, if we're going to win these things, they cannot be perceived as some stoner's proposal. Or if they are, they simply will not win. And rather than wait 10 years or 15 years when we might have the support to win those stoner proposals, obviously, what we have to do is stop the arrest of marijuana smokers. We have 850,000 people a year in arrest. So those academic exercises that we all engage in at times about should we wait 2 years or should we wait 4 years, we should wait no longer, folks, because, again, almost 1 million Americans are being arrested every year. Thirdly, I think we should not presume that we will enjoy that public support forever. And fourth, the principle that I think we need to keep a hold of is this is only incidentally about marijuana. It is really about personal freedom. And I will come back to that as well. Now, first, NORML as a consumer lobby. As Alan said, that really resulted from the fact that I graduated at Georgetown Law School in 1968 at the height of the Vietnam War, and I was radicalized by that experience. At that point, there was no lottery. If you were male, all males were drafted the minute you completed school until you were 29 years old. So I was radicalized to challenge the government on their war policy, and as I began to go to anti-war demonstrations, I was amazed at how many people were smoking marijuana. It became a symbol that it's not just the war we don't like, there are a lot of things we don't like about our government. And so I had first turned on marijuana. I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School before I ever smoked marijuana. I know a lot of you probably smoked a lot younger, and I hear people say that, hey, I was an alcohol drinker and a fraternity man as an undergraduate. So I remember some artsy, craftsy types in our fraternity who smoked marijuana, but I wasn't even curious enough to try it until I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School. I ended up avoiding the draft, and admittedly I was a draft avoider without question. I considered going to Canada. I had the Lawyers Guild lawyers offering to put me in touch with people in Canada, but there was no guarantee we would ever be able to come back into the country, and that seemed like an awfully high price to pay. I had psychiatrists in Baltimore who were willing to say I was gay, and back then if you were gay, that was it. You got out of the army. I was in favor of that, but my wife at the time, she apparently felt better straight, or better dead straight than gay. I don't know exactly, but that bothered her. She was uncomfortable. I got lucky, and with the help of these Lawyers Guild attorneys, I got what was called a critical skills deferment. And it was literally a provision of the Draft Act that said if the work you're doing domestically is so important that we don't want to interrupt that important work and send you over to the war. And my draft board, you never change a draft board. It's back where you were raised, and I was raised in a rural area, mostly working class people. They didn't go to college, so they didn't have deferments. And most of them got drafted, and a lot of them were coming back in pine boxes. And so my draft board, understanding that and resenting it, said, if you can give us a reasonable excuse, we'll give you a critical skills deferment. Well, I got lucky and I got hired by this new presidential commission called the National Commission on Product Safety. And it was a result of Ralph Nader's work. It was actually sponsored by Senator Warren Magnuson from Washington State at the time. They hired 2 lawyers from Harvard and 2 from Georgetown, and we were all avoiding drafts, so it was a great place to be. So during the time I would have otherwise been over in Vietnam, I had a chance to watch Ralph Nader up close. I'd never even heard of the concept of public interest law, but as Alan said, all it really means is, instead of using your law degree and training to try to get rich, you use your law degree and training to try to impact public policy. It can be liberal or conservative. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily pro-marijuana, but it means you're using your skills to try to impact public policy. Well, we used to go to Ralph Nader's office at least once a week because nobody had ever heard of this National Commission on Product Safety. So, but they all heard of Ralph Nader by then, and the Nader's Raiders had begun to come into town, graduate students from around the country. So they would write, anybody who had been injured by a dangerous product knew to write Ralph Nader. So we would go over and Ralph would let us go through his mail every day, and we would then use what we learned to go back and plan public hearings at the Presidential Commission. In any event, why that was important and why it helped shape my life was by the end of that 2-year commission, I was 29. I could no longer be drafted, so I could think about what I really wanted to do with my life, and I realized that I was no longer interested in practicing law to get rich. I wanted to be a public interest lawyer, but the issue that seemed important to me by then, I had become a regular marijuana smoker, and frankly, I was hanging out with some of the early Nader's Raiders, and they too were early marijuana smokers. And so I thought, okay, let's start a public interest lobby. At first, we thought about some kind of a bust insurance. We might do something where, you know, you pay $100 a year and you get busted, we'll provide a lawyer to you. But frankly, it was almost impossible to figure out what the risk factor would be, and back then some bar association wouldn't allow it, it would have been unethical, and so we kind of said, no, that's not going to work. So I came up with the idea of a lobby to legalize marijuana, and we played with acronyms, and fortunately, in one of the better decisions I think we ever made, we ended up with NORML, because I think it's proven to be a brand that people can understand, and it has a lovely double entendre. And so I ended up, because of that experience, being a true consumer advocate. I think it's terribly important in all areas of public policy, that you have a voice for the consumer to balance the voice of industry. Now, rest assured, as we get closer to legalization, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in commerce every year. And so don't worry about the industry. They will be well represented. They are beginning to be already, and they surely will be as we get closer. But what's important is that those policy decisions about how you're going to legalize marijuana not be simply made by the industry. The consumers must be involved. What consumers basically want in our area, I think, is no different than consumers want in any other area. They want a high-quality product that's affordable and convenient. Now, I want to quickly point out, the folks in the marijuana industry, whether it's a medical use industry or full legalization, they're our friends. Obviously, many of those people have been taking significant risks for years, or we wouldn't have had any marijuana to smoke. And if we didn't have any marijuana to smoke, there would be no legalization movement. So I don't want to suggest that they're our enemy. In fact, in most cases, they are our political allies. But when it comes down to those final decisions, and we have these various states that are going to determine, they're going to experiment with different models. It's not just going to be one model. But you can be assured that we need to make sure that the consumer voice is a major factor in those discussions and debates. We can't expect to get everything we want, but we have to be involved in that process, or it will simply be an industry process where they get rich. The main thing in a free enterprise system that an industry wants, they want to make money. There's nothing wrong with that. But it would be not necessarily being made in a way that would satisfy the consumers. So, again, I think as we get closer to full legalization, NORML is probably the only true consumer lobby involved in the drug policy debate. And it is terribly important that we keep that consumer focus as we move forward. Now, this second point I made briefly in the first day on the panel, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself to some of you who may have heard that. But as I say, there simply are not enough marijuana smokers in America for us to determine policy. We are a minority segment of the overall adult population. Now, I'd like to think over time that there will be more smokers, and I suspect there will be. But if most Americans thought marijuana smoking was a good thing, they would smoke it. And they don't, because they've spent their whole lives living under a system of prohibition with exaggerated claims from the government. So that's impacted their mindset. So what all the surveys show in these states with initiatives as well as just general surveys is that we now enjoy a majority support of the American public for ending marijuana prohibition, but not for pro-pot or not for pot smoking. So it is incredibly important that as we draft additional initiatives and legislation that we see and make that distinction. Our goal must be to end the practice of treating marijuana smoking as a criminal act and stop the arrest of responsible smoking. We do not need to turn on the world. I mentioned yesterday that I actually prefer the tomato model. I laugh about it because I don't think it's a realistic model that anyone should seriously propose, but it's what I would like if I had my own way. I mean, you can grow tomatoes, nobody tells you how few or how many, and you can share them with your friends or sell them to your neighbors. I think marijuana is no more risky or dangerous than tomatoes. But that's not the view held by the majority of the American public. And so rather than hold out for some system that's better or purer or closer to the tomato model, let's figure out what the majority of the American public will support, so long as it includes stopping the criminalization of responsible marijuana use. NORML has always said we will support it, even if it isn't perfect. So we got to be willing to accept some compromises. In the areas we need to be conscious of, some of them were discussed in that panel this morning with the different initiatives. The exit polling in California showed, among other things, that I think the #1 reason given by most people who voted against Prop 215 was a concern that we were going to turn loose a slew of impaired drivers on the highway. Now, you and I know that's silly. If people in California, there are the tens of millions of people who smoke marijuana in California, they're driving today, okay? They didn't hand in their driver's license. So if there's any real risk, we're already experiencing it, and I haven't seen any great upshoot or uptick in drunk driving or impaired driving or accidents caused by stoned drivers. So I think it's a fear that's exaggerated, but that's not the issue. The issue is it's a fear that's shared by a large number of Americans who otherwise will support legalization if we can reassure them on things like safe driving. Now, I don't like, per se, DUID laws. I don't think many people do. I would have preferred, for example, I-502 in Washington to have been a rebuttable presumption, and I can assure you that we argued as strongly as we could. Paul Armentano was involved for weeks in that debate, and we tried to make our best case, but we lost it, and for reasons that were discussed today. I think some of the serious law enforcement support they have in Washington simply would not have been available without having a parallel DUID provision that was parallel to the alcohol DUID, which is also per se. It's 0.08 per se. They don't have to prove impairment. So even though it's not perfect, we still support the initiative. Again, in future initiatives, I trust, certainly if Colorado wins, where they did not include it, then I think in further states when we have initiatives, we should get by, certainly without any per se standard. There may still have to be some DUI provisions included, but by the way, every state has DUI anyway. They have it whether it's in the initiative or not. So that's not particularly new. In addition, we also have to, lost my place here, sorry. Well, what I say is this, we have to approach we have to accept some limitations, whether we like it or not. We have to acknowledge that people are concerned about dangerous driving, and I think Ethan mentioned the third thing that was in that Prop 215 exit polling was they're concerned about people coming to work stoned. And so we have to figure out a way where we set their fears at ease. On the other hand, we want to try to avoid a situation where just because you have some THC in your system, they treat you as if you came to work drunk or stoned. That's absurd. So those are difficult issues, but they're issues we need to confront in order to satisfy the non-smokers who otherwise will support legalization. And again, I think what we have to do as we look at these proposals, we have to approach it the same way the vast majority of non-smokers do. They need to be focused on ending marijuana prohibition, not advancing our pro-pot agenda. And I know that disappoints some of our people, and at NORML we catch some hell about that from people at times and think we're not radical enough. But we are about winning, as Dominic said earlier today. It's one thing to have academic exercises, but folks, if we don't win, we keep arresting people. So it is terribly important that we shape these proposals so we can win. Now, third, we learned in the late 70s that even though you're riding a political high and the support of the public, the wind is at your back, and it feels exhilarating when you feel that. I think most of you can feel it now and wherever you're doing your work. And that's the way it was in the late 70s. We had decriminalized marijuana in 11 states between Oregon in 82 and Nebraska in 72. Oregon in 72 and Nebraska, I think, 77 or 78. That was the last of the 11 states. We fully expected within just a matter of 3, 4, 5 years, we'd have all the rest of the states because we thought, why did the country ever turn against us? Well, all I can say is they did turn against us. I don't know that anybody has a particular reason, but we had Ronald Reagan, we had Just Say No, but what the polls showed was that it was measurable. It wasn't just what the result of our legislation no longer moving forward. You could see that the American public that had begun to increasingly support stopping the arrest of smokers, it started going down in 78, 79, and it continued to go down until 1990. That's when it began to edge back up. And fortunately, Prop 215 in 1995 benefited from that. The mood of the country was coming back in our favor. We didn't win a single statewide victory for 18 years, from 1978 until 1996. And that's a long drive there, folks. I mean, 18 years without a statewide victory. We made some progress on local levels, but a lot of movements would have died, frankly. So I think, and partly what kept us alive is we also didn't lose any of those movements. They tried to overturn them in almost each of those 11 states that had stopped arresting smokers. There were efforts made by the anti-marijuana folks to say, well, let's go back and make it a crime again. They didn't win a single one. And so we held our own and kept our head low until the mood of the country came back in our direction. Now, again, the reason I'm making that point is simply to say, as good as it feels right now, and I am among those who have become a cheerleader, I believe we are going to legalize marijuana, and I hope 3, but I expect at least 2 states this November, and if we do, it will be a cataclysmic change in drug policy in this country and in the world. That when someone says to me, and people in good faith and who mean just as well, but who say, there's just too much compromise, let's wait 2 years or let's wait 4 years and come back. Folks, if you wait 2 years, you're talking about 1.5 million Americans more that are going to be arrested, even in a state like Washington, where it's been a big issue, of course. We've talked about it. There's been a lot of back and forth among the legalizers in Washington as whether I-502 has too much compromise. But they also have an average of 12,000 marijuana arrests a year in that state. Do you really want to wait 4 more years and have 50,000 more marijuana smokers in Washington state arrested because you're not totally happy with the DUI provision? I hope not. We need to do it while we have the support. As I said the other day, on the farm we used to say, make hay while the sun shines. But don't assume that we will always enjoy the same degree of support we do right now. There are larger factors at work that sometimes send that pendulum back in the other direction. Now, the last point is we're only incidentally talking about marijuana. It is really a much more important concept. I love getting stoned. I'm a stoner. And so even if it only was a matter of the right to smoke, I'd still be happy to work on it because it's a positive factor in my own life. I don't just think marijuana feels good. I know, as I said, I know it makes sex feel better and music sound better and food tastes better. But I think it does more than that. I think used in the right setting, marijuana can be an incredibly enriching experience. And we need to develop the courage to say that out loud. Marijuana smoking is not just not bad, it's good in the right setting. I want to wrap up by quoting briefly from a Supreme Court decision out of Texas. This is a U.S. Supreme Court decision out of Texas. The case is Lawrence v. Texas, in which Justice Anthony Kennedy, writing for the majority, said the following: "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, of the mystery of human life. It is a promise of the Constitution that there is a realm of personal liberty which government may not enter." Well, folks, if we first focus on personal freedom and ending marijuana prohibition, we will in fact return a measure of that personal freedom to the lives of tens of millions of marijuana smokers in America. It's time to do that. Thank you. Yes.
Well, I hope Keith's book comes out before Christmas so we all have not only something to read, but something to give to our friends, family, and policymakers. Thank you, Keith, for enjoying your retirement years with us. Scaring me to death. I mentioned in introducing Rick the other day that there's just really nobody else I've met 22 years at NORML who has been able to bring a mainstream face and sensibility to this discussion as a non-activist, but as a stakeholder. And some have heard the story of how I came to know that Rick was keen on NORML. For those who didn't, briefly, we've stuffed thousands, hundreds of thousands of envelopes at NORML, even in the world of the internet. And back then, we'd be flying through, and Rick Steves, more than one Rick Steves, Washington State, didn't do anything. And then one time, maybe 2 years later, in 94, 95, it went by Rick Steves, ETTB, Europe through the back door, or something. It was just what I thought, that's the Rick Steves. So I wrote to him, I was like, are you the Rick Steves? Because I bought your book, I went to Europe, I practically went to bed every night, only wearing a money belt. My passport, my money, my American Express checks, which was great advice, Rick. You should have seen who I was traveling with, so. And he wrote back. He said, I met Rick Steves, and he said, I'm really into hemp. Hemp is interesting to me. I like hemp. And then a couple years later, he was on the biggest radio station in San Francisco. And this is how Rick came out of the closet, if I'm not incorrect. He was asked, what is your favorite flavor of gelato? And he said, ganja. Right? If I'm lying, I'm dying, right? That's how, that shit coming out, and somebody who runs a very large business, very profitable business, well established in his community, and that was his soft introduction. And from that point forward, he said, I'm going to learn everything I can, read everything I can, I'm going to go to every lecture, every seminar, and he has. And so, beyond the fact that he's lent so much of his own credibility and can communicate so well, I mean, Rick does nothing else. I've given so much money to PBS stations, you soak me in the middle of the night. Okay? So, but the other thing that he did this past year was to become a stakeholder like nobody else. He was investing a lot of his own money. This is a very rare thing. Outside of Richard Lee and a few others, I mean, we ask people for money to do good. Rick is doing good with his own money as well, which makes him a hybrid like no other. So again, thank you for all these years, Rick, from just being a simple NORML supporter, just a $25 a year check supporter, to now getting us to the vanguard of legalization in Washington and around the United States. If it happens here, it will happen in a good part of the world. And I know you think of yourself as a world citizen, so if there's nothing else that you will leave a legacy for beyond teaching so many people to enjoy travel and culture, is that we too should not fear marijuana, and it's a good thing in our lives, and we should legalize it. Rick Steves.
Thanks very much. Boy, it's interesting because I get a lot of appreciation for just being public, because I'm a public person, I'm willing to talk about this. But it's so clear to me, everybody who brings a different set of tools to this team. And I'm just really thankful that there's a little niche for me, and I can let other people do the legal stuff and the local advocacy stuff and all sorts of other things. And when I come to this convention, it is always inspiring. So thank you very much, Alan. I go to a lot more travel conventions than drug policy conventions because of my work. I'm a travel writer, and I'm always trying to get people to travel in my work. And as I like to say when I give a talk about drug policy, I try to think, why do I even think about it? But if you've been there, you really know high is a place. It is just flat out a place. And as a travel writer, I'm trying to open borders so people can go to more places and carbonate their existence and just embrace life with a few little different angles and so on. And in a lot of ways, we're doing the same thing right now. We're opening borders. This is, in a good sense, I think, a travel convention. Now, in my work, I employ 80 people, and my staff kind of wonders where's my heart in running my business or in hanging out with you guys. And but a lot of my work as a travel writer is overcoming fear. Just an hour ago, I went up to my room and I got an email, and the Syrians have splashed into Turkey, and my people who are going to Istanbul are all nervous now because is it safe to go to Turkey? They're afraid. The media says this. What is the reality? What is reckless, and what is just not overreacting to hysterical media? So I'm trying to overcome fear. And we're dealing with a lot of fear in our work right now. There is all this fear. And one thing that's inspired me to speak out in areas well beyond just drug policy is just how fear is taking advantage of our great country. There's more fear being pushed these days than ever before. And it's clear to me, fear is for people who don't get out very much. And I found in my own work that, the flip side of fear is understanding, and we gain understanding when we travel. Now, when I think about our mission here, we are overcoming fear, and we are letting people get comfortable with seeing beyond a reefer madness kind of propaganda, and to understand that there's no reason to react like a lot of people react to drug policy reform. I find it's very instructive to look at prohibition, and a lot of people are saying, what about the feds? What if one state does this, and what will the feds do? Well, look back at Prohibition. Prohibition was a state-by-state thing. Back then, I believe New York was the first state to break away and do something against the federal government's wish. This year, perhaps Washington, Oregon, and Colorado will do that. A lot of people, as we know, we're talking about, oh, you're an incrementalist. My good friend Norm Stamper thinks I'm an incrementalist. Yes, Norm, I am an incrementalist. I want to go step by step, as we've been talking about. Prohibition against alcohol was taken down by incrementalists. At first, beer was legal and hard liquor was not. At first, you couldn't brew at home. Well, right now, we've got a president who brews beer. And I think in a few years, we may have a victory garden at the White House that will be blown away. So, we're all in this adventure together. We're dealing with these fears. I am impressed by how you can overcome fear with a track record. A lot of people are skeptical. Everybody's got a case to make. Everybody can spin statistics all they like. Show me your track record. 10 years ago, we didn't have as good a track record as we have now. We have a very strong track record, and as advocates, we can communicate that track record effectively, and I think let reasonable people overcome their unreasonable fears. I've been debating, this commander's lack up in Seattle and talking to people on the radio and so on, and most of the opposition is based on the notion that use will go up. I like to tackle that head on. I don't believe use will go up that much, and I don't particularly want it to go up that much. I just think there's a certain cross-section in our society that likes to fiddle around with drugs, and they shouldn't get arrested for doing that. And if a lot of Americans think there's a whole reservoir of people that would love to ruin their lives if only marijuana was legal. And I think the Europeans have found out that, there's just not that much pent-up demand. If you want to smoke pot, you do. It should just not be a crime. Now, when we think about the track record we've enjoyed, or we've gained over the years, of course, medical marijuana has been huge for that. I-75 in Seattle has been huge for that. The way different countries in Europe have experimented with drug policy has been huge in that. Portugal, as we know, with their Law 30, decriminalized the consumption of all drugs 10 years ago, and then gives us a track record. What's the result? Well, it's been 25 years since they arrested a pot smoker in the Netherlands, and their drug-taking population has not gone up. In fact, they smoke no more than the European average. And according to the statistics from our government and their government, there's no question Dutch kids smoke less pot than American young people do. There's no correlation, Europeans have found, between the strictness of the laws and how much are individual people consuming. A lot of people are worried about, the crime element and how many people are being locked up and all this sort of thing. As I mentioned, the Dutch have been very progressive on that right now. The Dutch like their approach. In fact, the Dutch are renting empty prison space to the Belgians. There's a reason for that. The Portuguese have looked at their situation over 10 years. They've found that use has not gone up any more than your trends overall in Europe, and that crime has not gone up. Crime, in fact, has gone out. A lot of people obviously are concerned about driving. I think you can look at the track record we have now with medical marijuana, with I-75. These people are looking for excuses to come down hard on us. And I know in Seattle, they've looked at it from a hard skeptical point of view, and they found that use has not gone up among young people, and problems with DUI have not been evident. I'm really interested in how concerned everybody is with public safety and protecting kids. That's just an overriding thing that I've found in the last couple of years speaking out in the Seattle area. And that's what law enforcement's mission is. I've talked to a lot of policemen. What's our mission? We want clear laws that we can enforce, and we want to protect public safety, and we want to protect the kids. So these are things we have to live with. That's what the people that are going to make these initiatives win have to be placated. They've got to be assured that this is not bad for public safety. As a matter of fact, it's good for public safety. If we look at the track record in that regard, we can go to other countries and see what happens when you roll back progressive attitudes towards marijuana. I know in Copenhagen, they've had the first murders on their streets in years because they clamped down on the marijuana that was being sold in Christiania. Obviously, people want marijuana. Obviously, if you can't get it from a coffee shop or a dispensary or a liquor type store or at a stall at Christiania in Copenhagen, you're going to have to buy it from people on the streets, and then that's going to bring turf wars, and that's going to bring crime in the streets. And Copenhagen and the Netherlands have found exactly that. There's a lot of discussion lately about what are the Dutch doing. You know, we've got friends in Holland, a lot of us have been there, all the coffee shops, and there's this notion that they're going to overturn that now. It's not as simple as who's going to win this election. They've got a new conservative government in place for the federal government. It is really going down to a battle of wills between the federal government in the Netherlands and city governments. City governments are firmly in favor of their current coffee shop model, because city governments have to deal with crimes on their streets. And they know every time you roll it back, you got consumption not going down, you got crime and violence going up in your streets, and that's why the mayor of Amsterdam is standing up against the leader of the country, and it'll be an interesting thing. But the mayor of Amsterdam knows that, 20 years ago, Zeedijk area, the sailors' court direction, was a no-go zone. There was a bridge called Pill Bridge, and it was just really, I remember, scary going there. And this is where all your hard addicts were, and all of your pushers and everything. I was just there a couple months ago, and because Amsterdam wanted to take those no-go zones back to their regular citizenry, now there's trendy little cafes and restaurants, and it's a very, very thriving area, and they've got their coffee shop model where people want to experiment with drugs go for their soft drugs, and where the police can help communicate dangers in the streets about hard drugs, and the hard drug population in the Netherlands is way down. The hard drug taking population in Portugal, I think one of the reasons for Law 30 10 years ago was because they had such a spike in hard drug abuse. They had 100,000 drug addicts, and now I understand 10 years later they've got 50,000 drug addicts. And those drug addicts see their government not as the enemy, but as an advocate, because now they're realizing that drug abuse is not a crime, but it is a health problem and an education challenge. This is all track record stuff. When we think about all of these areas where we've been able to get a track record to learn from, most of them are dealing with decriminalization. And I find this very frustrating because I'm interested in the international story of this, and I've learned through my travels that the United States has actually extorted the rest of the world to stick with us in our hell-bent determination to keep marijuana illegal. When I leave Christiania, my friends tell me, be careful here in Denmark, we have to arrest a couple of pot smokers every year in order to maintain favored trade status with the United States of America. That's embarrassing. And I just am embarrassed. I'm ashamed of our country for that. And most Americans would be also if they knew what the law was. But our country has, and I'm not an expert in these kind of issues, but I understand our government has created a law through the United Nations that everybody signed, and this law requires all signatories to wage trade sanctions against any country that has the nerve to flat out legalize marijuana. That's why we have these silly decriminalization and I-75 kind of solutions, just because you've got to try to dodge that bullet from these trade sanctions. It's just too expensive for people. I think that this is going to be changing. My hope is when we come together for next year's convention, Uruguay, Washington, Colorado, and maybe even Oregon will be the first entities like this to not do decrim, but to actually have legalization. That is quite exciting. The whole, we've talked about this descent within our ranks here on how far should these initiatives go. And I want to say that it is natural for any organization like this to be all together until we're faced with success. And then you got the reality that what are we going to do if we actually win this battle? How are we going to, where are we going to go from here? And we get into the fine points, and that's where there are going to be misunderstandings. And I think many organizations have had the same reality. I'm interested in European history, and to me it's pretty parallel to the whole situation in Ireland against Britain. You know, for centuries, the Irish were all together fighting the British. Finally, after heroic struggles, I mean, imagine breaking away from Britain, they find themselves free, and the next year, Ireland is embroiled in a civil war, and more people died during the Civil War than during the bloodshed they had to get freedom from England. You know, we don't want that. We are going to be finally free, and I think that fierce debate within our ranks is healthy. But I really believe that we should not bring us down when some of us are going out there and actually making something happen. I think in a public way, you don't need to support it. But to oppose us publicly, once we've decided that this is going to move it forward, to me is not good for any of our interest in legalizing marijuana. I was a little frustrated when I got involved with my friends at New Approach in Washington for I-502, because I was all excited to bring my European perspective into this, which is what I've been talking about with my friends at NORML for 10 years or whatever, and I just like bringing in what I think is a very sensible European approach. And the I-502 people are very sort of professional, poll-driven, kind of political savvy people, and they just said, I know, Rick, but it doesn't poll well. So we got to be concerned about these, you know, public safety, taking care of kids, driving while intoxicated issues, and I've gone with that. One thing that the pollsters all told me was, we're not going to change the opinion of the people on the right who are just against this. We need to get out our base and let these people know that this is our chance, and we need to be out in force. And Ethan said that today also. And I think they're probably right, but still, I'm going to take the other approach. I love going into the conservative corner and talking this up. I just absolutely, personally, strongly believe that if I can sit down with 100 people who are predisposed to be against any drug policy reform, and if I can just get their ear for half an hour, I can have them leave that room, not necessarily with me, but realizing this is a complicated issue, and they haven't got the full story, and there are reasonable people that care about their communities, that are not just pro-pot, but they are pro all of these concerns that the people against us are concerned about. So I'm very, very excited about this opportunity to, assuming and knowing that the truth is on our side, and assuming and knowing that we can make a case for conservative people, in a lot of ways on their terms. There's so many ways you can spin this. I'm going on a barnstorming tour around our state starting next week. I'm going to 15 different cities in 8 days, and it's just going to be one of the most exciting weeks of my life, and I'm very, very excited to go to the most conservative towns in our state and explain to this frightened public that, you know, we are going to do this for the betterment of our communities. You know, of course there is the, you know, the kids issues and understanding that we're not going to be having dangerous drivers on the road. Of course we can talk about we're going to divert hundreds of millions of dollars from gangs and organized crime into public accounts where we can do really exciting and good stuff with that. Of course, medicinal marijuana is valid and important. Of course, there is all sorts of racism and ugliness in that regard to the whole policy of marijuana drug policy reform. But for me, the number one thing is it is a civil liberty. And as I like to say, everywhere I go, and that's why I'm just inclined to go with my passion for this to NORML. Everywhere I go, I love to just remind people that I am a hardworking, church-going, kid-raising, tax-paying American, and if I work hard all day long and want to go home and enjoy a little marijuana, that's my civil liberty. And that is also very normal. So I just want to, you know, every time I come here, I leave home just inspired and charged, and it's such a thrill to be part of this team. And as it's been said many times, we're all sort of benefiting from the people who have worked hard and succeeded and failed, it seems like, but overall, we're all together moving this ball forward, and I can hardly come back next year and celebrate even more. So thank you very much, and happy travels, even if you're just staying home.
Rick has been narrating, of course, his TV show for so long. He does a podcast, which I download every day. So Rick, you're in my head. Just the voice for about 20 years. And I never really thought about the fact that so much of your travel business is just to relieve people, we ethnocentric Americans, who want to go and travel, but need somebody to do a little hand-holding. And so I think that your work with marijuana is an obvious extension of that, to be sure, and we're blessed with your resources and your enthusiasm, to be sure. And we don't know what the conference will be next year, but we look forward to hopefully celebrating that your home state, Colorado and Oregon, went over that Rubicon. And of course, Arkansas. And I love Massachusetts again, but to see Arkansas get medical marijuana would be a lovely, lovely thing in American politics. We're going to bring up the next panel. I hope Paul Armentano is very close by. Is this the next panel?